Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on inclusive clinical studies for equitable access to clinical research in Europe, which is topic 3 of IHI Call 4. So before we get started, just a couple of important disclaimers. You should be aware, first of all, that the call topics are still under consultation with the States Representatives Group and the Science and Innovation Panel, which are IHI's advisory bodies. And so the draft topics that are online and the information presented today is still very much indicative and could change. As soon as we launch the call, which we hope to do towards the end of July, you will find the final versions of the topic texts on our website and the funding and tenders portal, and you should consult them carefully because they may be different from what we present today and what is online now. So another important note, we are recording this webinar and we'll be publishing the recording and the presentation on the website and the BTMatch platform. And I also realized I forgot to introduce myself. I'm very sorry. My name is Catherine. I'm a member of the IHI communications team. And in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Nathalie Seigneuret, who is the scientific officer responsible for this topic. And then we'll go over to Amberly Banerjee, who is presenting the topic for us. And then we'll come back to Nathalie for some final few slides. And then you'll have plenty of time for questions. And we also have in the room Desmond Barry of our legal team, in case you have any questions on our rules and procedures. Okay, so on that note, I will hand over to Nathalie.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and good morning. So today is a pleasure to do a webinar on the inclusive clinical studies for equitable access to clinical research in Europe. Now, be aware that this webinar today will cover the introduction to the IHI program, the presentation of the topic text as it is by the lead industry pre-identified consortium, and we have the pleasure to have Amberly Banerjee from Novartis. And then we will touch on the proposal submission evaluation, and at the end, as was mentioned by Catherine, on tips for writing a successful proposal. Be aware that we will not cover the rules and the procedure since we had already a webinar on Monday this week, and it's already available, the recording and the presentation on our website and on the BTMatch platform. Now, in a nutshell, the Innovative Health Initiative is the new partnership in health between the European Union, represented by the European Commission, and the Healthcare Industry Association, represented by COSIR, focusing on imaging, radiotherapy, health ICT, and electronic medical industry. EFPIA, including Vaccine Europe, so representing pharmaceutical and vaccine industry. Europa Bio, biotechnology industry, and MedTech Europe, medical technology industry. Our objectives are defined in the regulation, and as you can see in these slides, are very ambitious, since IHI is due to turn health research and innovation into real benefits for patients and society, deliver safe, effective health innovation that cover the entire spectrum of care, so from prevention to diagnosis and treatment, particularly in areas where there is an unmet public health need. Finally, IHI has the objective to make Europe's health industry globally competitive. That's set in our strategic and research innovation agenda, our most objective, and define what kind of activities we will perform in order to address this objective. So the focus is really on cross-sectoral approaches to facilitate the creation of new products and services to prevent, intercept, diagnose, treat, and recovery more efficiently. The goal is to lay the foundations for development of safer and more effective healthcare product or solutions that respond to unmet public health needs and that can be implemented into healthcare systems. Now, it's important to remember that our partnership, so the Innovative Health Initiative, is supporting research which remain at the pre-competitive level. Now, if you would like to know more about the strategic research and innovation agenda, you have the link on these slides, and you are welcome to read it more carefully. Now, this topic will be part of the call, what we call a two-stage call, and it's important to remember how it works. So we will have the call launch, and we hope to have it sometime end of July, to once we have all of the topic text approved by our governing board as part of the annual work program. So in the two-stage call, as the name says, we have two stages. The first stage is for the applicant consortium. So in a simple way, what we will call the public partners who can receive the funding have to apply and have to compete. So they have to form a consortium that can be composed of academics, hospitals, regulators, patient organizations, small and medium-sized enterprise, for-profit legal entity with an annual turnover less than 500 million euro. So together, they will put a proposal that will be submitted, that will go for evaluation. And in a two-stage call, it's only the first rank proposal by independent expert that will be invited for the second stage, and join the pre-identified industry consortium in order to build the full proposal that will be again submitted and reviewed by a panel of independent experts. And if everything goes well, then we enter into the granting phase with the grant preparation, signature of the grant agreement, which is between the project coordinator and the IHI, and the signature of the consortium agreement, which is between all the partners. And then the project can be launched. So this is a nutshell, something to really keep in mind on how the two-stage process works. And this is applicable for this topic that now is going to be presented by Ambili Banerjee. Ambili, the floor is yours, and tell me when to change the slide.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you to all of you for joining and for your interest in this topic. Today, I plan to cover three aspects. If you move to the next slide, first I'll start with talking about the challenges. We'll then talk about the proposal itself. And lastly, we will come to what the participants, the applicants, can actually be interested in terms of how you can contribute to this specific project. As Natalie said, there should be plenty of time at the end for questions. So to start with, the overarching challenge here that we're trying to tackle is a lack of representativeness in our clinical trials that reflect the patient populations that use the products. So we know recruitment and retention is a challenge for all the pharma companies that try to conduct clinical trials, and there is limited diversity within those recruited patient populations. And we know underrepresentation creates a knowledge gap about both the risks and the benefits of these technologies for these specific populations. And this specific topic is aiming to develop a multifaceted approach to overcome the barriers that are associated with the recruitment and retention of underserved patient populations in clinical studies. And we'll come in a short while to talking about that word underserved, which I'm sure many of you would like to understand better. What we're trying to do is transform the way clinical studies are conducted in Europe to make sure that they're more representative in those patient populations. If you move to the next slide. And because this challenge is highly complex, we know this cannot be tackled just by individual stakeholders working in isolation. The beauty of the IHI project and this specific partnership is the non-competitive nature of it, the neutral setting that enables us to share experience from our different facets and ensure that we can reach this common goal. And we know we have to collaborate with stakeholders across the health ecosystem, including patients and caregivers, academics, healthcare practitioners, industry partners, clinical investigators, sponsors, contract research organizations, regulators, health technology assessments, payers, social scientists, and ethicists, etc. I'm sure there are a multitude of functions that are not mentioned here. So it just shows you the complexity of the stakeholders we would like to collaborate with us. And setting up a cross-sectoral, multidisciplinary public-private approach is the only way we can actually make progress on this fundamental area that we have to address in order to make sure those trials are equitable. If you move to the next slide, please. So the next few slides are actually outlining the scope, but I wanted to just show you what the different elements of the scope involve. And as mentioned, because it's highly complex, we do have to think about this problem holistically, which means that we have 4 specific areas we want to tackle. I'll start with the landscape. As mentioned, we have to start by agreeing the definition of underserved, because there is no common definition that exists across Europe or across different sectors. So agreeing what that entails in combination with the regulators is going to be a key starting point for us. We also would like to establish a sustainable patient-centric platform that connects the various stakeholders involved in running clinical trials. More about that on the next slide. We know this is not going to be successful unless we develop targeted activities at a community level, hence the pillar on community engagement. How can we get patient input in order to develop that trust with patients and develop solutions that are suitable for those patients that we're trying to reach? In order to take the burden away from the patients, we also know that investigators and clinical trial sites play a fundamental role. And this project is trying to address if we can increase the number of community-based sites so it becomes easier for patients that are underserved to access it, and to expand the pool of investigators and site staff from those communities, again with the aim to build trust. We know that some of these tools will actually help all patients, not just diverse populations that we're trying to reach. Lastly, the protocol design elements are to establish criteria for measuring representativeness so we can actually establish if we are making progress in achieving this. We also want to look at tools, solutions, strategies, looking at how we can broaden our eligibility criteria. If you move to the next slide, please. So a little bit more detail on each of the individual aspects. So on scope, as I mentioned, we will start by defining underserved populations. That includes populations facing socioeconomic, systemic, or cultural barriers that prevent access to clinical studies today. And this could include gender, age, race, ethnicities, the refugee populations across Europe, the homeless population, disabled communities, and many others. And that's exactly where we need to work with the regulators on the data that we can collect to establish this aspects. Secondly, we're trying to estimate the current participation of these study populations, success in recruitment and retention. We know a lot of this work will have to happen at a country level, and we have to understand the barriers that are preventing these underserved populations from accessing trials. So the social, the cultural aspects have to be understood. The pillar around building a patient-centric digital platform is fundamental to making this project successful, because we have to have a means of having a platform, a one-stop shop, if you like, where patients can access all clinical trials that are available to them, irrespective of which company is running them. And in order to do that, in order to attract patients to this specific platform, we also have to make sure that the patients are able to access support organizations, support materials. Therefore, patient support organizations will also be housed on the same platform, alongside sponsors and clinical trial sites and CROs and all the other stakeholders that need to be connected on running these trials. It's really critical that the platform is built with the patient in mind, and so the platform should use lay language, make use of existing resources that exist already, such as clinicaltrial.gov, but make it patient-centric, patient-friendly. And we also have quite a lot of infrastructure in Europe, where various IHI projects have mapped various sites. We know that the CTIS platform already has co-location of both the sponsors, the ethics committees, as well as regulators on that platform. So the intent is to connect some of the infrastructure that already exists in Europe. The underlying principle is that the needs of the underserved populations are considered when we develop this digital platform. We also have to establish the governance structure, the maintenance, the ownership of that platform. A lot of these solutions will be developed at a very local level, but we know that sponsors are running global trials, multi-regional clinical trials, and therefore we have to bear in mind how the data from a local perspective will roll into a global submission. And so understanding both the local approach as well as the global approach has to be maintained. Moving on to the next slide, I'll cover community engagement. So this is really about understanding what the patient barriers are, what the lack of interest in participating in those clinical trials are coming from. So we really need to raise awareness of the benefits of the clinical trials by developing educational activities, inclusive toolkits, to build that knowledge and trust in those target populations, those underserved populations, towards clinical studies, to overcome some of their reluctance in participating in the trials. And this has to be established over a longer term sustainable way. And we have to establish those connections at a local level through researchers, industry stakeholders, patients, caregivers, investigators in the community. We move on to the next slide. In terms of the clinical trial infrastructure, we have to strengthen that by building new site capabilities and develop training activities to increase community-based sites and to increase the pool of investigators, including those from underserved communities. We know that patients want to see people like themselves as investigators and site staff, and therefore we have to upskill some of these investigators who may not have participated in clinical trials. So naive investigators have to be set up in geographies where that infrastructure is lacking. We want to create the necessary support mechanisms and define specialized training, cultural competency training, or naive investigator training to make sure these stakeholders can be helped or onboarded to run clinical trials. Existing resources already exist in terms of clinical trials transformation initiative or other projects run in Europe that can be leveraged to help set up the infrastructure needed for upskilling investigators and clinical trial sites. If you move on to the next slide. And then the fourth pillar is around protocol design and clinical operations. So this starts with the responsibility on the sponsor companies to establish criteria for measuring representativeness, obviously in conjunction with various other stakeholders, to help determine if you're making progress in moving the needle towards more representative trials. We want to look at what's currently available by sharing experiences across what's working, what's not working in the current solutions that are being used. But we want to also identify where we can improve in terms of narrow eligibility criteria or our methodology that could be improved to enable broader patient and community engagement. We want to develop a set of tools, recommendations, strategies to enable that increased representation in studies that are for medicinal products, devices, or IVDs. And we want to validate those approaches through participation, recruitment, and retention of diverse patient populations. If you move on to the next slide. The industry consortium were very focused and aligned on the fact that we didn't want this to be just a paper exercise. We wanted to run use cases through the project to ensure that we could see a difference in how that recruitment and retention or the success of the tools and solutions we've put in place in terms of driving increased recruitment or retention. So the pilot use cases will be determined during the project because this is a long-term project, and currently it's unclear which specific indications will be used, but it will be based on the availability of those use cases from those sponsor companies in discussion with the consortium on which disease areas will be selected. The proposed disease areas will constitute an unmet public health need and a significant burden on the patients. And the proposed areas are likely to be representative to allow broad implementation across diverse disease areas. We are currently planning to pilot 3 use cases or more. The purpose of the pilot use cases is to test those tools and solutions, both to assess recruitment and retention, and assess the functionality of the digital platform that's set up. Applicants are expected to consider the potential reg impact of this. So in terms of making sure that the appropriate evidence is being generated and talking to the regulators to make sure that that will be acceptable for regulatory submissions. In the proposals, applicants should leverage and build on existing tools and solutions as well, and best practices that have been developed with a multitude of other IMI, IHI projects or other activities that are happening both at a European level or at an international level. If you move on. So expected outcomes. So if everything goes to plan, there are huge wins here for multiple stakeholders. So not only will we strengthen those tools and solutions to recruit a diverse and representative patient population, but it will also be community informed, so suitable for patients. So firstly, the patients will benefit from an easy to use digital platform, which will be built with their input, enabling easier access to trials. And hopefully the access to community-based sites will also reduce the burden for the patients to have to travel much further to access those clinical trials. Investigators will benefit from cultural competency and the education that will help them reach more diverse populations. And we're also building that pipeline of investigators for the future and site staff from those underserved communities. Sponsors will benefit from obtaining more generalizable results, leading to better innovations for them and greater trust that they will build with society. A toolbox of new approaches will also help increase the rate of patient recruitment and retention and lead to better designs of clinical trials, hopefully, for the future. Regulators and health technology assessments and payers will benefit from a better risk profile, better benefit risk profile across patient populations, and a better understanding of what underserved or underrepresented populations have as barriers, and hopefully will also lead to harmonization of data standards across Europe. If you move on to the next slide. So the expected impact, we should have enhanced representativeness of underserved population in clinical studies across Europe, awareness and understanding of what diversity, underrepresentation, underserved communities look like in geographies across Europe, including barriers and current gaps in the recruitment and retention in different clinical studies. You should be able to increase study data reliability and genetic diversity by including different demographic groups, and therefore enhancing patient trust in the evidence that we're gathering for developing our products. More patients should benefit from that increased access to improved innovative technologies, including medical products, medical devices that meet the specific needs and profiles of those patient populations. And we should be able to promote implementation of new tools, solutions, approaches, or process models that reduces the burden of clinical studies from those patient populations. If you move on to the next slide. So let me outline what the industry consortium will be contributing to the specific proposal. Expertise in, amongst other specializations as well, expertise in legal, ethics, compliance, reg, diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of clinical research design, study design, both at a local level and at a regional level. At a minimum, 3 use cases are expected to be tested in different disease areas, and these are likely to be the pilots to test all of the infrastructure that's established during the project. Industry can also contribute to the elaboration of educational program and training materials for the investigators. There's capability to enable that platform to be used widely. This specific project has a lot of industry stakeholders involved, and hopefully the numbers involved will lead to that adoption as a single solution to enable that uptake broadly across patient populations and other stakeholders. We also have an opportunity here to leverage existing IMI IHI initiatives and Trancelerate contributions that we are already involved in through industry collaborations. If you move to the next slide, please. So this is perhaps the most important slide of the presentation. It's really how you can help us in developing a partnership that can achieve these really important goals for the patients. Firstly, project management expertise in running these cross-sectorial projects will be invaluable. We're looking for partners with expertise in building a patient-centric digital platform that connects that health ecosystem for a whole host of stakeholders that I've mentioned. We would love to work with partners who have strong relationship with patient representatives or patient organizations that can help gather those patient insights to ensure patient centricity in all elements, not just the platform, but also from a protocol design, from what would work from a site perspective, etc. The next bullet point about changing behaviors and mindsets is fundamental for the success of the project. So we would love to work with public health experts, social scientists, behavioral scientists that can help understand how we change behaviors and mindsets from populations that have previously been very reluctant to engage in clinical trials. We know there's a key aspect here of working with regulators on the specifically the underserved, what the underserved population means and how we collect data that could inform those trials in a much more powerful way. So knowledge of regulatory aspects of drug medical device development would be beneficial. Experience with localized epi data, it would be important. A lot of this hinges on data. We also would like expertise in gathering those patient insights from clinical studies, such as input to protocol design, user acceptance of the platform, etc. And communications. How do we leverage social media reach? So any expertise in health sector communications would be really beneficial. Also, cultural competency training delivered to the sites and onboarding of naive investigators would be useful. And then knowledge of the existing clinical studies and site databases across Europe, so we can map all of that, would be a huge advantage. If you move on to the next slide, please. In terms of the budget for this project, we have a 28 million in-kind contribution from the pharma companies. There's 28 million which would be matched from the IHI. Therefore, we're looking at a large budget for this public-private partnership. The duration of the project is a 6-year project. Looking to, if it goes ahead, obviously following consultation, it's expected to launch around September 2024. Moving on to the next slide. I'd just like to thank you for your attention and happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Billy. And before we take any question, I will continue a little bit with some information on how to apply. But first of all, it's important, as you have heard, the topic as presented by Abili, that no one contact the topic writer directly. So again, we want to make sure that any question you may have after this webinar is directed directly to the IHI office, and you can get through the applicant's email address, which is on this slide. Just a point about the proposal submission and evaluation. So you have heard now about the what the topic entails. Of course, with the again the disclaimer that this is not yet the real call launch, and it's subject to some changes. But in terms of for you to start thinking of submitting the proposal, there is a template for the submission of the proposal, part A, which is more the administrative data that is entered directly in web forms through the funding and tenders portal. The part B, which is the narrative part, and the narrative part includes 3 sections: excellence, impact, quality and efficiency of the implementation, and annexes. And in terms of annex for a short proposal, it's the participant tab. Now, in the template itself, which is available on our website, there are instructions under each of the section that I just mentioned that gives more instruction on what is expected to be written down within the question, within the section. So it's really important that you read the instruction in this proposal template very carefully. In terms of the evaluation criteria that are going to be used by the independent experts as part of their evaluation, these follow a grid that, in a sense, mirror the proposal template, since it will address the excellence, the impact, and the quality of the implementation. And in terms of the excellence, it's important to that the expert will have a look at the clarity and pertinence of the project objectives, etc. So I won't go through, but again, this information is online, and it's very important because yourself, you can, when preparing your proposal, a little bit judge the quality of your proposal against this evaluation criteria. And as I said, the 3 evaluation criteria, the main one, are following the proposal template per se. Now, what are tips that we can give you in order to help you to prepare your short proposal? Well, what is really important is to read carefully all the call relevant material, especially the topic text. Now, the topic text currently is under future opportunities, because again, officially the call is not yet launched. But as soon as the call is launched, all the information will be on the applying funding open calls. It's important, and this webinar start really the exercise that to start thinking and build the consortium early, and always think public-private partnership. It's really important because, as Ambili presented, so you will have the contribution coming from the pre-identified industry consortium, the contribution expected, but overall, everybody should have the same goal and should fulfill all the objectives of this project, of this topic, sorry. Ensure that all information requested in the call text on the proposal template are fulfilled, and it's provided to allow the evaluation experts to easily assess your proposal against the evaluation criteria. The expert will only look at what is written down. So if it's not written down, they cannot guess. So this is really important, again, to keep that in mind. As Ambili was saying, it's really important that you consider and plan for the potential regulatory impact on the results, and therefore early on think of a strategy and a plan on how to fulfill that to maximize the results. In terms of finding the project partners, we know that it's not easy and that you need to build or to join the consortium. Now, there are some tools that can help you. First of all, to network with your contacts. That's something that is always very important, but as well with the IHI Call Days participants. And again, we do have the platform and the list of participants that can really help you to create some contacts already. Then there is the partner search tool which is under the EU funding on tenders portal that can be used. You can get in touch with your IHI national contact point, and here are the link where you can find all this information available, and network on social media. And again, we have put some of the website that may help you. But we cannot emphasize enough that you need to start early and really start reaching out to some people in order to build or to join the consortium. How to book your meetings via the B2Match platform. Here it's quite easy. There are 4 steps. Make yourself available. Look for partner of the participants or organization tab. Select date, time, attendees, and you can have up to 8 participants per meeting. Add message, send the meeting request, and wait for the reply. But of course, we do have more information again on how to book the meeting, so that you can refer to. And now I think it's really time for the question time. for the questions.
Yes, so thank you, Natalie and Amberly. So we currently only have one question, and the question is does the scope of the call also include healthy volunteers for early clinical trial phases? I think that's one for you, Amberly.
Yes, yes, it does. So we're looking across the board from phase 1 to phase 4.
Okay. If anybody else has any questions, do drop them into the chat. As we mentioned earlier, if you have questions after the webinar today, which is normal, especially as we publish more updated drafts in the final version, as we said earlier, don't send them to Amberly or any of the other topic writers, even if you know them. Send them to us at the IHI office at applicants at ihi.europa.eu. I'm just going to, while we wait for some more questions to come in, maybe we can just flag up to you that this is, of course, just one of a series of webinars on the call for topics. So as we mentioned earlier, on Monday, we had our webinar on our rules and procedures. And if you are in any way interested in applying for this or any of the other topics, I would really encourage you to listen into that webinar and catch up on what was said. We are aware that IHI is not a simple creature. You do need to understand who we are, how we work, and what the rules are, and it will help you avoid making any potentially silly mistakes. So do have a listen to that webinar. And we have all the other topics there as well, some of which may be of interest to you. And then next week, we're moving on to call 5, which is a single stage call. Call 4 is obviously a 2-stage call. So call 5 is a single stage call. So we will have another webinar on the rules and procedures for single stage calls, which are slightly different and have some important elements you need to be aware of. And there you can see as well the topics. And we also have a webinar on preparing the financial part of the proposal, again, focused very much on the single stage calls, because in a single stage call, you'll be submitting the full proposal now, whereas obviously in a 2-stage call, you're only submitting the short proposal. One thing maybe just while we see if any questions come in, a question maybe for Desmond, because when we were speaking before the webinar started, Amberly mentioned that she'd heard that there are some colleagues in the UK who might be interested. Maybe could you just give a quick overview of, I know it's in the rules and procedures webinar, but just to give other people time to ask questions. What's the situation for UK participants? I understand that they can certainly participate, but what are the rules regarding funding?
Yeah, so I would actually refer interested parties to the rules and procedures webinar where we get into a lot of detail on this from Monday. But briefly, just to reiterate the main points, obviously we have the situation with the UK at the moment, and they haven't signed what's called the association agreement between the UK and the EU, which means that technically they're treated as what's called a third country, which is outside the member states and the list of associated countries. However, all that means basically is that the UK entities are, of course, welcome to participate and are fully eligible to participate. The question comes as to whether they can actually receive funding. So the situation is that they can participate. Their funding they should receive from the UK RI, which is the UK governmental body who's basically funding in the interim. How this basically works is that, strictly speaking, at the proposal stage, the UK participants should identify as beneficiaries, and basically we will treat them as beneficiaries all the way through the proposal stage, and if it's selected for funding, then through the preparation stages as well. And then when we get to the grant stage, if there's still no association agreement in place between the EU and the UK, then they will become what's called associated partners. Associated partners are a bit different from beneficiaries in that they are identified in the grant agreement, but they're not subject to all the rights and obligations that normal beneficiaries are. So how we would see this working is then some of those rights and obligations would then be reflected in the consortium agreement, which would basically allow the UK participants to participate fully in terms of intellectual property and that kind of thing, but they would receive their funding from the actual UK instead of IHI.
Thank you, Desmond. So we still don't have any questions, so I think we can probably close the webinar. So again, if you have questions after today, do send them to us at IHI, applicants at ihi.europa.eu. Do keep an eye on the website for updated versions of the topic text, and of course the final versions when the call is launched. We will also be publishing an updated version of our guide for applicants, which I highly recommend you read. We are working on the update now and it will be published shortly. Desmond is nodding, so that's a good sign. Meanwhile, we do have some questions, and one of them is for you, Desmond. You will be happy to hear it's the other country which used to be associated to the framework programs but currently isn't, Switzerland. So someone is saying, can you add and explain that participants from Switzerland are eligible to participate, and if the proposal is successful, the funding is provided by the Swiss national government?
Yes, so that's our understanding. So again, I mean, I think it's clear that the Swiss government and the Swiss approach is very well organized and articulated at this stage. So, of course, if you're coming from Switzerland, I mean, you're clearly eligible to participate. That's absolutely no problem whatsoever. And then it seems, just on anecdotal evidence and from my discussion with Swiss participants, that the system is very well organized. So, and further, we're anticipating that, you know, an association agreement will be signed between Switzerland and the EU. So I think this is very much a temporary measure, but the temporary measure is well catered for. So those Swiss entities then, as I said, they would receive funding from the Swiss government. They're welcome to participate in the project. They'll participate as associated partners, and, you know, they'll be able to participate fully in the project if it goes to the funding stage.
Great, thank you. And now we have a question for Amberly. Since the industry consortium brings expertise in legal and regulatory aspect, does this mean that they will contribute the most in defining with regulatory bodies a definition of an underserved population, or should this be covered by the public consortium?
We plan on engaging with regulators, but obviously input from other partners would be welcome. We're talking about diversity here and diversity of thought. Industry partners will all have a certain perspective. Actually having perspective from other partners would be welcome. But yes, the industry partners will be working on the framework to engage with regulators.
Maybe I can just add one point, because obviously, of course, the industry participants or pre-identified consortium will bring all this expertise, but it will be definitely a work from the consortium. So that definitely will have to be defined as well at the time of the consortium and how to approach, and that will certainly be discussion when preparing the full proposal. So I think it's not one versus the other one. At the end of the day, it's a consortium joint effort, and whoever will have the expertise what will be needed to do this joint effort.
You articulated that much better than I did.
To that as well, Natalie is our in-house regulatory expert as well, so she does a lot of work to make sure that our projects really engage with regulators early and get things going as soon as possible, because it's very important to get that impact. So we don't have any more questions, so if anybody else wants to ask something now while we have Amberly here live and on hand to answer, then type now or forever hold your peace. Otherwise, I will end the webinar and say thank you very much to Amberly and Natalie for their presentations. Thank you to Desmond for answering the more legal questions. Thank you to all of you for your interest in the topic, and good luck with your proposals and with your networking. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.